Breaking right now, the British royal family mired in one of its biggest crises in history.
Sirens didn't wail, but behind palace walls, a silent alarm detonated. A confidential file surfaced, and within hours, the monarchy's future was hanging by a thread. A covert escape structure worth tens of millions was abruptly frozen, children's passports flagged, and Prince Harry made a decision that left aides visibly shaken and Meghan's camp scrambling in disbelief. Was this about custody, control, or a secret deal that went too far? One move changed everything. This wasn't a family dispute, it was a royal interception. The hidden exit strategy. Long before the courtroom doors opened in Santa Barbara, a far more calculated plan had already been drafted, quietly, carefully, and in extraordinary detail. Dated January 18, 2026, a 42-page internal document known as Project Mirror outlined what investigators would later describe as a full-spectrum relocation strategy. This was not a vague idea about starting fresh. It was a structured multi-year blueprint connected to a reported $37 million media development package tied to a subsidiary linked to the Qatari Sovereign Fund. At the center of the proposal was a permanent move to Doha. The document mapped out everything: housing arrangements, security protocols, education placement, even long-term branding architecture built around the royal status of the children. A bespoke international school in Doha had already prepared draft enrollment paperwork. Metadata later revealed repeated access to those forms under Meghan Markle's administrative login. The plan also explored a dual citizenship sponsorship clause, an honorary pathway that could anchor the children legally within Qatari jurisdiction. That clause changed everything, because once jurisdiction shifts, so does leverage. Financial channels supporting the move appeared equally deliberate. Records pointed toward a network of offshore entities, including Echo Clover Limited, registered through structures in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. Between late 2025 and early 2026, private aviation logs showed multiple round-trip flights between Van Nuys Airport in California and Doha. The bookings were reportedly made through intermediary corporate shells rather than personal accounts. Individually, each detail could be explained away. Together, they formed something far more strategic. What made Project Mirror explosive was not ambition, it was timing. On February 11, 2026, Prince Harry and Meghan had agreed to a structured custody framework under California law. That agreement operated within the boundaries of the Windsor, California Reciprocal Accord of 2024, a treaty designed to protect the custodial stability of minor royal heirs across jurisdictions. Relocation without mutual written consent was explicitly restricted. Project Mirror appeared to create an alternative pathway. Legal analysts reviewing the framework later noted that a move under sovereign sponsorship in Qatar could have complicated enforcement mechanisms under the Hague Convention on the civil aspects of international child abduction. Even if no violation had yet occurred, intent carries weight in family court, especially when cross-border custody is involved. In simple terms, the blueprint suggested a future where the children's lives would unfold beyond the automatic reach of both US and UK oversight. The financial scale of the package, reported at $37 million over multiple years, was structured as a media partnership rather than a direct custodial arrangement. But embedded within that partnership was exclusive access to the lives of two royal minors. Education, appearances, development rights, mapped out over phases. This was not just relocation, it was reinvention. Inside the palace, the discovery triggered a shift from silence to strategy. For months, tensions had simmered beneath public statements and mediated agreements. But this was different. This was documentation, aviation records, enrollment drafts, offshore transfers, a relocation manual dated and structured. It suggested preparation, not impulse. And while the world debated narratives of independence and institutional control, one reality became unavoidable. If Project Mirror succeeded, the children's jurisdictional anchor would fundamentally change. What the architects of the blueprint may not have anticipated was that financial oversight mechanisms tied to royal-linked assets were already under quiet review. Because as the servers were examined and the travel logs surfaced, another process had already begun behind closed doors in London. And Meghan hadn't calculated one critical variable: Prince William was already watching. But what if the real battle wasn't in New York, but inside London, where William was already calculating his silent move? Stay with us. The silent freeze from London. As the implications of Project Mirror began to surface, the reaction inside London was not explosive or emotional. It was procedural. Within days of the January 18, 2026 documentation coming to light, Prince William convened a closed session with the Royal Household Financial Office. There were no public statements and no visible signs of panic. What followed was far more controlled. The first step was containment. All Windsor-linked assets that were co-managed with Prince Harry, including trademarks, licensing streams, and deferred royalty agreements, were placed under independent escrow review. The objective was simple. Nothing tied to the royal institution would be liquidated, transferred, or leveraged without scrutiny. At the same time, a $7,800,000 savings portfolio previously accessible through joint structures was frozen by court order. The 33-acre Hartwell estate in Gloucestershire was flagged for asset review. These were not symbolic gestures, they were financial breaks. The timing mattered. Project Mirror depended on movement. Relocation requires liquidity, predictable cash flow, and control over branding rights. By initiating escrow protections and asset freezes in mid-February 2026, William effectively slowed the machinery that would have supported a permanent shift to Doha. But the financial review did not stop at asset containment. Forensic filings submitted to the California Superior Court revealed $2,300,000 in personal expenditures between 2022 and 2025 on joint credit lines. The itemized records included $480,000 in high-end fashion purchases from Hermes, Dior, and Elie Saab. There was $670,000 allocated to private aviation, including solo flights to Abu Dhabi and Nice. Another $310,000 was directed toward image consulting and media training services. These numbers were not presented as scandal. They were presented as a pattern. Harry's legal team, led by Miles Armitage, cross-referenced American Express and HSBC statements with Archewell corporate logs. The allegation was that certain personal expenses had been categorized under foundation-related descriptions. Around the same time, redacted documentation from the United States Treasury Financial Crimes Enforcement Network referenced two Cayman Islands accounts linked to Echo Clover Limited, an entity structured through the British Virgin Islands. Between August and December 2025, approximately $890,000 in transfers were reportedly received from Dubai-based event organizers. When the palace activated the 2023 Crown Transparency Statute and forwarded documentation to the United Kingdom's Serious Fraud Office, the financial dimension of the custody dispute expanded into something more systemic. Meanwhile, internal morale at Archewell faltered. Senior staff members, including the Director of Brand Partnerships and the Deputy Legal Counsel, resigned within 24 hours of the disclosures. Industry partners such as Spotify and Penguin Random House were reported to be reassessing 2026 projects amid concerns about reputational exposure. In London, the strategy remained consistent: remove uncertainty, stabilize institutional assets, ensure that no financial channel connected to the monarchy could be redirected toward an overseas restructuring of custodial control. The $37 million framework outlined in Project Mirror may have been ambitious, but ambition requires fuel. By the morning of February 14, 2026, much of that fuel had been placed under lock and review. What appeared to be a private marital breakdown was now intertwined with escrow notices, statutory triggers, and international compliance protocols. The relocation plan had not yet moved forward, but the infrastructure supporting it was steadily being restrained. One account, one property, one trademark at a time. And now, as every account, property, and trademark quietly tightened, did Harry's choice of fatherhood secretly ignite a silent royal rebellion? Stay glued. The moment Harry chose fatherhood over rank. By the time the financial restraints tightened in mid-February 2026, the battle was no longer abstract for Prince Harry.
After many, many years of lies being told about me and my family, there comes a point where, again, going back to the relationship between certain members of the family and the tabloid press.
What had begun as legal filings and asset reviews became intensely personal the moment Project Mirror was read into the court record at the Santa Barbara Family Law Courthouse. Until then, he had heard fragments, strategic discussions, legal language, defensive explanations. But seeing the structure laid out in dated pages, January 18, 2026, stamped across the header, shifted something inside him. The 42-page manual was not theoretical. It outlined timelines, educational transitions, jurisdictional shifts, and media positioning. Enrollment documents for a bespoke international school in Doha had been drafted. Court-appointed forensic experts later testified that those files had been accessed repeatedly under Meghan Markle's administrative login. There were references to dual citizenship sponsorship pathways and residency sequencing. To legal observers, it was a relocation strategy. To Harry, it was a map of a future he had not fully understood. More alarming were the encrypted communications introduced during preliminary review. Among them was a request sent to a Qatari legal consultant seeking clarity on sovereign custodial protections and non-extradition guarantees. That phrase alone carried weight. It implied planning beyond branding or philanthropy. It suggested anticipation of resistance. Harry had already endured years of public tension with the monarchy, but this was different. The question before him was not reputation. It was accessible. If relocation proceeded under sovereign sponsorship in Qatar, enforcement of custodial rights could become complex under international frameworks. Even with the protections of the Windsor, California Reciprocal Accord of 2024, cross-border jurisdiction is never simple once residency changes. On February 16, 2026, as arguments intensified, Harry's legal team filed a motion requesting independent psychological evaluations for both parents. The filing cited stress records from 2019 to 2022 and concerns raised during mediation. It was not framed as an attack, it was framed as a precaution. 2 days earlier, on February 14th, the court had already been informed of financial freezes and escrow reviews initiated in London. The legal pressure was mounting from multiple directions. When Justice Maya Caldwell issued an emergency order requiring the children's passports to be surrendered to a neutral third party and mandated monitored digital communication between the children and their mother pending further review, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. This was no longer a contest of narratives. It was judicial containment. Witnesses later described Harry sitting unusually still as the metadata surrounding Project Mirror was explained in detail. 14 separate accesses to school enrollment forms within a single week. Flight logs documenting round trips between Van Nuys and Doha in late 2025. References to media exclusivity clauses embedded within the broader financial structure. For years he had defended the decisions that distanced him from the institution of his birth. He had argued for independence, for autonomy, for a life outside inherited expectation. Yet in that courtroom, faced with the possibility of losing day-to-day proximity to his children under a jurisdictional shift, the calculation changed. That evening, as discussions continued behind closed doors, Harry drafted a personal statement. It would not be signed as Duke of Sussex. It would not carry the styling of Prince. Instead, he chose his birth name, Henry Charles Albert David. The choice was quiet but deliberate. It signaled not a return to palace life and not allegiance to any faction, but a narrowing of identity. He was no longer positioning himself between institution and spouse. He was positioning himself between risk and his children. The financial mechanisms had been restrained. The relocation infrastructure was under scrutiny. But the emotional turning point occurred in that sealed courtroom in Santa Barbara, where titles felt distant and the only role that mattered was father. So did he finally choose his children over legacy? Or was this courtroom silence just another strategic move in a hidden royal battle? Stay tuned. The Crown's quiet countermove. While Prince Harry wrestled privately with the weight of fatherhood inside a California courtroom, a very different strategy was unfolding thousands of miles away in Windsor. There were no urgent press conferences and no emotional rebuttals. Instead, the response from the British royal household was measured, deliberate, and unmistakably structured. On the evening of February 12, 2026, just days before the most critical hearings in Santa Barbara, Catherine, Princess of Wales, appeared in a short video filmed at Grey House, the residence prepared for Archie and Lilibet during their stays in the United Kingdom. The setting was simple. Behind her hung children's artwork in bright, uneven colors. There were no formal regalia and no dramatic statements. She spoke for exactly 90 seconds. Her message was calm and direct. She emphasized that any role she was called to carry would be handled with grace and clarity. She did not reference legal filings. She did not mention Project Mirror. She spoke about stability and innocence. Within 8 hours, the video had been viewed 11.4 million times. In Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, public sentiment shifted sharply. The narrative was no longer about conflict between adults. It became about protection of children. Behind the scenes, institutional preparations accelerated. Under the direction of Princess Anne, the Custodial Advisory Committee was formally activated in mid-February 2026. A legal brief was delivered simultaneously to the United Kingdom Family Division Court and to the British Consulate in Los Angeles. It confirmed that Duchess Sophie of Edinburgh had been appointed as a co-guardian during any custodial transition involving time spent on British soil. The language was precise. It framed the move not as interference but as preparedness. Then came a development that surprised even seasoned royal correspondents. Lady Louise Windsor, daughter of Prince Edward, arrived at Dulles International Airport under diplomatic cover from RAF Northolt. She was accompanied by 2 child welfare officers and a trauma psychologist. Her visit was grounded in the Windsor, California Reciprocal Accord of 2024, the same agreement that had once secured title recognition for the children. Under its provisions, minor royal heirs could receive welfare review support if reputational or custodial risk was identified. Her presence was not symbolic. It was procedural. Attempts by Meghan's legal team to cite a California injunction against foreign custodial interference met a complex barrier. The international status of the children, combined with treaty protections, meant that oversight protocols were difficult to block outright. Lady Louise's role was observational, yet her arrival signaled that the palace was no longer reacting to events. It was anticipating them. The contrast in approaches became striking. In Santa Barbara, filings expanded and counterclaims intensified. In Windsor, mechanisms were activated quietly, almost clinically. Financial containment had already begun. Asset reviews were underway. Now, emotional containment was being constructed through visible stability. Catherine's brief appearance, Sophie's appointment, and Louise's diplomatic mission formed a coordinated response without overt confrontation. It was soft power, but structured soft power. The institution was building layers of reinforcement around 2 children whose lives had become entangled in global headlines. As the hearings in California continued to expose documents and metadata, The British monarchy did not escalate rhetoric. It recalibrated jurisdiction, protection, and narrative. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. Stability would be demonstrated, not declared. And as February 16th approached, it became increasingly clear that this was no longer a simple custody dispute unfolding in one courtroom. It was a transatlantic contest of systems, unfolding in parallel, each move measured against the next. So what did February 16th really reveal about this transatlantic battle? Was it strategy collapsing, or a hidden move no one saw coming? Keep watching. The day the strategy unraveled. As diplomatic reviews unfolded and institutional safeguards tightened across the Atlantic, all eyes returned to Santa Barbara. The hearings scheduled between February 16th and February 18th, 2026, would determine whether the growing web of documents, flight logs, and financial disclosures amounted to precaution or proof. By the morning of February 16th, the Santa Barbara Family Law Courthouse felt less like a local courtroom and more like the center of an international reckoning. Inside, the tone was clinical. Court-appointed forensic specialists presented the digital trail connected to Project Mirror. Metadata timelines were displayed with precision. The January 18, 2026 document was dissected line by line. Access logs showed repeated reviews of enrollment drafts for the bespoke school in Doha. Aviation records confirmed round trips between Van Nuys and Qatar during late 2025. Communications referencing sovereign custodial assurances were entered into the record. Each detail, taken alone, might have been defensible. Together, they formed a pattern that was difficult to dismiss as hypothetical planning. Then, the financial layer was added. Statements submitted earlier by Harry's legal team resurfaced in full. The court examined the $2,300,000 in personal expenditures between 2020 and 2025, including $480,000 in luxury fashion purchases and $670,000 spent on private aviation. Transfers totaling $1,100,000 to the United Arab Emirates were scrutinized alongside documentation connected to Cayman Islands accounts linked to Echo Clover Limited. Joint investigations by the United Kingdom Charities Commission and the United States Office of Tax-Exempt Organization Review placed potential misappropriation estimates between $2,700,000 and $4,400,000. Affidavits from former Archewell staff members were introduced. Some alleged that research and development costs tied to Project Mirror had been categorized internally under broader outreach initiatives. The testimony did not speculate on motive. It focused on the process, the classification of expenses, the sequence of approvals, the timing of transfers. By February 17th, the courtroom dynamic had shifted noticeably. What began as a custody renegotiation had evolved into a layered examination of intent, oversight, and jurisdiction. Meghan's legal team, led by Sher Tilden, maintained that Project Mirror represented exploratory brand planning. They argued that interest in the Middle East aligned with global expansion, not custodial evasion. But the combination of relocation detail, financial routing, and timing relative to the February 11th agreement complicated that defense. Justice Maya Caldwell listened without visible reaction. On February 18th, she delivered her ruling. The February 11th custodial framework would remain in force as the permanent structure governing the children's lives. Any relocation attempt without mutual written consent would require a $5 million bond. Meghan Markle was ordered to reimburse $1,300,000 to the frozen joint estate within 90 days for misallocated foundation funds. The Archewell Foundation itself was directed toward dissolution, with remaining assets frozen pending distribution under charitable trust law. Perhaps most consequential was the restriction placed on commercial use of institutional identifiers. For a period of 10 years, no new entity, trademark, or media product could incorporate the terms Arch, Windsor, Sussex, or Lily in a commercial context linked to the dispute. control of the children's primary social media presence was transferred to the Royal Child Welfare Trust. Then came the sentence that reverberated far beyond the courthouse. Justice Caldwell stated clearly that motherhood could not be invoked as both shield and weapon. The courtroom was silent. When proceedings adjourned, observers described an atmosphere of exhaustion rather than celebration. The relocation framework had been halted. The financial infrastructure surrounding it had been dismantled. What began as a strategic blueprint tied to a $37 million package had ended under judicial order in courtroom 4B. Outside, cameras waited. Inside, the legal architecture of the dispute had been fundamentally rewritten. Now could the collapse of a $37 million plan hide a deeper betrayal? Who truly rewrote the rules inside courtroom 4B? The choice that redefined everything. When the courthouse doors closed on February 18, 2026, the legal battle had reached its formal end. But for Prince Harry, the real reckoning was only beginning. The ruling delivered by Justice Maya Caldwell had halted relocation plans, dismantled financial structures, and imposed strict custodial boundaries. Yet the most profound shift happened after the cameras pulled back, when the noise of litigation faded and the weight of consequence settled in. For years, Harry had lived suspended between identities. He was a son of the crown and a man who had walked away from it. He was a public figure shaped by history and a private father trying to build something safer for his children. Inside courtroom 4B, as evidence was reviewed and decisions were sealed, those identities finally collided. The relocation framework tied to Project Mirror was no longer theoretical. It had stopped. The financial engine behind it had been restrained through escrow reviews and judicial orders. The children's passports were secured, and their digital exposure transferred under institutional oversight. The fight was no longer about strategy. It was about what remained. That evening, Harry released a short, handwritten statement through the royal family's official website. It was not delivered at a press conference, and it carried no ceremonial language. What drew immediate attention was the signature. It did not read Duke of Sussex. It did not read Prince. It read Henry Charles Albert David. To palace historians and legal observers alike, the choice was unmistakable. This was not a temporary distancing or a symbolic gesture crafted for public sympathy. By using his birth name, Harry was separating himself from rank, styling, and inherited authority. He was choosing legal clarity over legacy and personal responsibility over position. The timing mattered. The statement came just hours after the ruling that confirmed the February 11th custodial agreement as permanent. It followed the court's restrictions on commercial use of royal identifiers and the transfer of social media control to the Royal Child Welfare Trust. The message aligned with the direction of the judgment. Titles could no longer serve as leverage. Fatherhood now stood alone. Inside the royal household, the response was restrained. There were no announcements about reinstatement or reconciliation. The monarchy did not frame Harry's decision as a return or a rebellion. It was treated as final. The Sandringham Declaration on Sovereign Minor Protections, prepared in the wake of the hearings, ensured that the children's status would be protected regardless of where Harry positioned himself within the institution. Observers noted the contrast between brothers. While Prince Harry narrowed his identity to one role, Prince William had spent the previous weeks reinforcing structures that outlast individuals. William's approach had been procedural, not emotional. Asset containment, treaty enforcement, custodial preparation. The system moved forward whether individuals embraced it or not. For Harry, stepping away from titles was not an act of defiance against the crown. It was an act of retreat from conflict. By signing as Henry Charles Albert David, he removed himself from the machinery that had defined his adult life. What remained was a father bound by court orders, legal frameworks, and the daily reality of showing up. There was no applause when the statement went live. There was no visible relief, only a quiet acknowledgement that something irreversible had occurred. The battle over jurisdiction and finance had been resolved in court. The battle over identity had been resolved on paper. And as the evening settled over both Santa Barbara and Windsor, it became clear that one chapter had closed, not with ceremony, but with a name written carefully at the bottom of a page. But could the carefully penned name at the bottom signal a silent surrender, or is this the start of a far deadlier reckoning? After the battle, the Sussex reckoning. By the evening following Harry's formal renunciation of his royal titles, the reverberations across the monarchy were immediate and unmistakable. The Royal Gazette released a series of rapid updates detailing the sweeping administrative changes now in motion. Key trustee positions once held by the Sussexes were promptly vacated, leaving Archewell's governance in disarray. The Grey House Protection Act, designed to safeguard the family's youngest members, was formally ratified, ensuring that the children's welfare would remain insulated from any lingering external pressures. Within days, Archewell itself collapsed. Staff members, once loyal and bustling with ambition, began cooperating fully with authorities, providing crucial documentation and testimonies that confirmed the earlier findings of financial mismanagement and operational instability. Media outlets shifted their tone almost overnight. An editorial in the Washington Post highlighted the stark contrast between the earlier public fascination with Meghan and Harry and the current scrutiny over their choices and obligations. The narrative was no longer one of glamour or rebellion. It had become a meticulous chronicle of accountability. Public sentiment mirrored these developments. Approval ratings for the Sussexes plummeted from a once supportive 52% down to a sharp 28%, reflecting the growing perception of isolation and legal constraints surrounding Meghan. She now faced a life circumscribed by court orders and restricted freedoms, confined more by jurisdiction than by choice. Harry, on the other hand, had relinquished his titles, yet found a fragile stability in his retreat. Stripped of official rank, he gained clarity of purpose, his attention fully on fatherhood and protecting the children. The youngest members of the family were now shielded under the Sovereign Minor Protocol, a protective framework that would safeguard them from becoming tools in any future media or legal battles. The contrast was undeniable. One half of the Sussex duo was legally bound, isolated, and politically vulnerable. The other, though stripped of royal privilege, had regained agency, focus, and a measure of peace. This moment wasn't a matter of vengeance or spectacle. It was a clear assertion of jurisdiction and institutional authority, a statement that no personal ambition or celebrity influence could circumvent the centuries-old mechanisms designed to protect the monarchy and those it served. So, what do you think? Was this a custody battle, a financial meltdown, or the moment Prince William showed that even modern fame can't outplay centuries of tradition? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.